You are watching a video in the Woodlawn series. We sat down with a number of individuals who either worked in, lived in, or invested in the Woodlawn neighborhood. From those conversations, we hope to learn from and learn about Woodlawn.
Hi, my name is David Helm, the pastor of Christ Church, Chicago. We are on the northwest corner of 62nd and Woodlawn in Woodlawn. To learn more about us, you can see us at christchicago.org. We're renovating what was St. John the Baptist Temple and hope to be in that building in the fall of 2021. Tonight, though, in this episode, we look at, again, Woodlawn, learning from and learning about. And we've got a great guest with over 2 decades of history living in the environment here, working in the context, Dan Koehler. Dan is the Associate Dean of the College for Academic Affairs at the University of Chicago. I know Dan pretty well. He's also a member in our church, and his wife runs our children's ministry. He did his undergrad at the University of California, Davis. He received his master's and PhD from the University of Chicago in history. He liked looking at higher education. And so what a perfect fit, having lived in this neighborhood for a couple of decades and over the last 7 or 8 years with the university. And most recently, what is it, Dan, 2 or 3 years now? 2 or 3 years as the Associate Dean of the college.
About 2 years, yeah.
Great. Well, welcome to Woodlawn, learning from and learning about.
Well, thank you.
Tonight, we're just gonna talk a bit. Now, we really are excited to hear your perspective in regard to Woodlawn as it relates to the university and its relationship. But where would you like us to begin? Let's let the university sit for a bit. And what can you tell us just about the origins of Woodlawn, particularly given your own interest in history?
Sure. Well, let me back up a little bit and talk about some of the research that I do for the college and for the university. So
Sure, absolutely.
One of the areas that I'm in charge of for the college is research and publications about university history and the history of higher ed. And we produce a number of publications every year, and we edit some other ones that are written by students and graduate students, and we work with faculty. And so from being involved in those projects over the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time in the university archives and in the archives of the city of Chicago, Harold Washington Library, and other places. And so my understanding about the university and some of the neighborhoods that surround it really come from picking up pieces and threads that come out of archives. So there are a lot of anecdotes that I can drop in that have just appeared randomly, and other things that I've read. But that's where a lot of this interest comes from, is the historically evolving relationship between the university and the communities that surround it.
Well, that's great, because I think those who will be watching these over time, we have a great interest in learning about Woodlawn and learning from you with your affiliation and the university. It's that dynamic exchange between those two worlds that I'm certain has a rich history and complicated. But I look forward to hearing what you have to tell us tonight.
Sure. Well, let me start off by sharing my screen here. I have some slides that are going to introduce us to a bit of Woodlawn's history that I think should be useful. So here's one to start.
That looks spectacular.
And that is actually a picture of 62nd Street from 1892. I found a lot of these special collections at the University of Chicago. And I thought it would be helpful to start us off to wind back to the original construction of both Hyde Park and Woodlawn and the university neighborhood, to look at why these neighborhoods look different and why they're built the way that they are and why they developed in different ways even before the 1950s and the era of urban renewal and a lot of the issues that we've probably talked about in other presentations. So one of the things that we should look at is, what is the place of these different neighborhoods in the city economy? And both Hyde Park and Woodlawn get a big boom out of the World's Fair, of course, and the building for the World's Fair. But there is a difference between them. Hyde Park was actually pretty well established even in the 1880s. And with the announcement that the university was going to be situated in Hyde Park in land that had been donated by Marshall Field, where the current quadrangles of the university sits now, there was a lot of, not speculation, but high-end investment in Hyde Park. So structures that were supposed to last for a long time, a lot of pretty high-end housing. So if you look at the large homes that have stone masonry on the front of them that are on University Avenue or Woodlawn Avenue, those were built in the 1880s and 1890s in anticipation of having like board of trustees members or senior faculty who are going to come and live in them. And so by the time that the World's Fair is being prepared for, Hyde Park has a population of about 18,000. Woodlawn, by contrast, so just to the south of the Midway, is hardly developed at all. So when it's announced that that the World's Fair is going to come and sit along basically a mile of land in Jackson Park, Woodlawn is there just to be opened up immediately, and it gets this massive investment. But it's also a place where you don't have a lot of sort of community organizations or infrastructure. So you get a mixture of kinds of development that you don't have in Hyde Park. And one of the big differences, this is why I started with this photo, is that you have frame construction and wood construction. You don't have demands for masonry and stone masonry. And this was a big dividing line between sort of upper middle class and working class construction and different kinds of structures. So Woodlawn, when it booms, it has all of its roads built, it has several train stations built. There are a couple of entry points to the World's Fair. And then you get hundreds of cottages for stonemasons and bricklayers and plasterers and welders and so on who are working for the fair. You don't have as much of that in Hyde Park because it's already well developed. And in both places, you have lots of hotels that are built. But Hyde Park has all the high-end hotels that are for out-of-town visitors and foreign guests. And the sort of the long-term rentals, the single occupancy, et cetera, those go in Woodlawn. So you get streetscapes that look more like this in Woodlawn. And I can go to the next slide too. I have to.
Well, it's fascinating, even just as you do that, hearing again the influence of the World's Fair on how these different neighborhoods developed. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is another example of different kinds of construction at Woodlawn. This is 63rd Street looking west from the railroad tracks. And you can see again, just different kinds of construction. There's brick, but there's also wood and vinyl siding and so on. But there's also a lot of undeveloped land. So Woodlawn kind of grows up overnight. Now, the reason that this is important is because Hyde Park is kind of set on a really firm footing around the university. It's set up to succeed and thrive even after the fair is over with, because the infrastructure that is built and the hotels that are built and the housing that is built is going to be there long term. And there's a thought, well, you know, even if you don't have 100,000 guests who are coming through after this leaves, you still will have students coming through. There's going to be a surge of faculty and staff. That's not quite the case for Woodlawn. So what you get after the fair closes is, well, first of all, there's a mini Great Depression that happens from 1893 to 1894, and you have lots of empty buildings. And all of these hotels in Woodlawn are converted into apartments that are relatively small, and they're of cheaper construction. Okay? And then all of those cottages that were built to house workers also become working class housing. So you can see how even out of the very beginning boom time, Woodlawn and Hyde Park are already set up along different kinds of paths. They're different kinds of communities. So at the turn of the century, what you get in the difference between these communities, there's a lot of openings for like amusement parks and places for gambling and amusement and nightclubs in Woodlawn. And you also get a lot of lovely homes, single family homes that are built in the area It's really popular for younger faculty and staff because it's more affordable, then as now, than Hyde Park is. But it also doesn't have the kind of strength of investment in community organizations that Hyde Park does. They're just different. Right? So they establish these different characteristics. One anecdote I would bring up from my boss told me once, his parents had actually lived in Woodlawn as children just after World War I in the 1920s. And they lived at the very south end that was close to the cemetery. And their vision of the university in Hyde Park was it was someplace that was sort of way out there, and they didn't want people like us coming in. Right? So they were Polish in ancestry, and they were workers, and their sort of economic line was to go south. It wasn't to go north. And the kind of ethnic makeup of Hyde Park was always, at this time, it was founded by kind of Northern European, upper middle class, if not people associated with the university, then people who worked for banks and law offices and so on downtown. So a different kind of place in the economy of the city.
Fascinating.
Great. So let me take you up to the next slide here. All right. So let's talk about the university itself and what it was founded as and how it was supposed to relate to its surrounding neighborhoods. This is one of the original plans for what the university in its entirety would look like. This was drawn up by Henry Ives Cobb and published in 1893. Now, one of the really distinctive things about the University of Chicago and its campus was that it could be imagined all at once as a whole, as a whole landscape, by contrast to other universities that came about, one building at a time. So you have funds to build one building and you build something else and you expand outward from a core. The University of Chicago here clearly looks a lot like a walled medieval town, right?
Right. With all the inner quadrangles, it is as if life exists on the inside of it, but not necessarily on the outside of it.
Yeah, and there are two impulses within the founding of the university I want to talk about, and these are impulses that are still with us. But one of those is that the university is kind of a cloister, right, or a monastery in a way. It's supposed to be a place where you're set apart from the city, and you're given scholars who come in from all over the world, and students are given a quiet, contemplative spot where they can study, they can research, they can think about huge problems, and they do it in this kind of, quasi-monastic landscape. The reason that the university could be imagined this way was that there wasn't a lot else here. So Hyde Park, even though it had several thoroughfares that were well built up, this area was open. So they understood the original grant from Marshall Field that all of this was deeded to the university, so they could think of it as like an abbey, and being built this way. And the argument has been made by historians like Neil Harris, who is a historian at the university for a long time, that this actually informs the way that the university expands and the way that it thinks about its surrounding neighborhoods. Is that the vibe of the university and the neighborhood fits this. It fits this monastery. And that the rest of the university, or the rest of the area, is supposed to provide sort of safety, an area for contemplation. And it would be the polar opposite of steel mills, or like back the yards, or the things that Upton Sinclair was writing about in the jungle. So that's one impulse. And this actually, a lot of this is built up pretty quickly. And if you look at this, the front of this image, that actually is 59th, and the area to the south would be Woodlawn. So as the university is built up, this is an image of Harper Memorial Library just after it was completed, and this is in 1913. So you really do get this image of a gray Gothic contemplative fortress, and there's so little that is immediately not only on the Midway or 60th or 61st, but on the frontage of Woodlawn, that everyone can see Harper Memorial Library from a mile away, even when you don't have other buildings that are here along 59th Street. So that's
that picture. It kind of the Midway. So now you're post World's Fair, which that Midway would have been filled with activity.
Mm-hmm.
But it almost seems like it functions here like the backs do behind Cambridge University, where almost just outside of the university, you have this great grass swath of really no intention other than the visual lines and the ease of your day. Yeah, it's really interesting for me to know that the divide between, say, Hyde Park and Woodlawn is this pronounced in this beautiful, like, landscape situation, but the fortress is standing.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the administrative leaders of the university prior to, say, World War I, and they didn't intend this kind of fortress mentality or image. They were drawing inspiration from these buildings from great European universities.
Sure.
And if they looked at, so the University of Berlin or Vienna or the Sorbonne or Cambridge, they all had these visually striking buildings that were alongside a great boulevard.
Right.
And you had people alongside the boulevard that would enter in. The difference here was that, and for the reasons we already discussed, Woodlawn was just different. It wasn't an extension. Woodlawn was not the university neighborhood. Hyde Park was the university neighborhood, and Woodlawn was developing into something else already at this time. So, yeah. So that's one impulse that I wanted to talk about. And this is how it manifests by about 1919. This is an aerial shot that just captures some of what I was talking about. You get most of the university is built up. You see here, this would be the main quadrangle, 57th Street. But again, looking south into Woodlawn, you have very dense housing in Woodlawn that you don't have in Hyde Park. So it's not tenement housing. It's high enough quality apartment housing, but it's dense. And a lot of it is the remnants of these hotels from the World's Fair. So again, you can see the Harper Memorial Library and some of the other buildings that are popping up in the university campus from quite a ways away.
Fascinating to me, because we're at 62nd and Woodlawn. It looks like we're just out of reach of that photo in the lower right corner.
I tried really hard to find one that would capture.
No, it just would have been it. Yeah, no, it's that close, isn't it? Yeah, go ahead.
So and it also took a lot of funds to put up a building like the church building or like Woodlawn Baptist. Those were also very expensive to build with brick and stone. And those were also, the funds for those came before World War I. And it's because you did have a pretty strong middle-class tax base that was in Woodlawn, and you had parishioners who wanted to attend those churches and could support them. So I don't want to overstress the kind of working class character, but it was of a different nature. So,
Sure.
So that's one impulse I wanted to talk about that operates in the university and still does. It's the kind of cloister mentality, which you can sense as you walk around in the quadrangles and see students, not now, but normally, who are sitting and studying. But there's a second one I won't talk about as much, but we have to keep in mind. And one is that all of the first presidents up through the 1930s, and then a lot of the really famous faculty in the social sciences and the professional schools thought that the only reason a university like this should exist in Chicago is if it were grappling expressly with the social problems and the new urban realities that you could see in Chicago. And
Right.
they believed, so Chicago is a site of massive immigration, rapid industrialization, huge population growth, and then you have these great reform efforts that are located in places like Jane Addams' Hull House and what would eventually become the School of Social Service Administration. You had faculty and a number of departments who were involved in this. So alongside this cloister mentality, you have something utterly different, which is that it's a strong belief that professors and students should use their expertise and their schooling to get outside of the university and serve the city, usually through research,
Right.
by doing what universities do. And whatever knowledge is produced is better because it comes from Chicago and it's in dialogue with all of this. But then it can also be put to the best uses. So those two things those course through all of the university's history, and they're still there, and they operate in the same people. So you can find, administrators at different points who say kind of contradictory things. So,
but that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because there is a great interest in the university for the city, and a lot of the field work, anthropology, sociology, all the social sciences, are very interested in providing the best knowledge, and the same is true today. In one of these previous episodes, we were speaking to someone, and the issues that are arising, the answer to the issues is going to be in the data that's collected, so that you can actually see what needs to be brought. Mm-hmm. And so this whole field work mentality is still in play in Chicago and through the university in Woodlawn.
Yeah, and these same faculty believed they could actually do things that were intellectually superior to any other university because they were doing it in Chicago. So Chicago is they believed it's where the juice was. If you needed to know how to address homelessness or juvenile delinquency in their terminology from the 1920s, you could do that in Chicago in a way you could never do it in Palo Alto or Princeton.
Yeah, right.
You could do that in Chicago because you were living it. You saw it every time you got on the tram. So that's how they thought. So that kind of brings us up to the 1920s and 1930s. The university, as you can see here, actually doesn't have any property in Woodlawn until the end of the 1920s. Everything is located in this cloister area in the quadrangles, but the expansion into Woodlawn starts in the late 1920s with the building of a dormitory and dining hall, which is actually just out the window from me here. It's called Burton Judson Courts, and the building of a power plant. And then there's successive purchases of land in the strip between 60th and 61st Street through the 1920s, up through the early 1950s. And by the 1950s, where this starts to become politically very sensitive, even volatile, the university has acquired about 60% of the properties that are within this swath. But in its original planning, it doesn't have anything. Right? One other thing, the university really until the 1940s doesn't pay a lot of attention to city issues as an administration, because it doesn't have to. If the area is, if it's prosperous, if there's little crime, if faculty can go about their business, if students can enjoy whatever pleasures the city offers, et cetera, then there's just a lot less to fight over. It's just something, you don't find it in the archives anywhere. Yeah. With one exception that I would note, I'm sure some of the other presentations may have talked about restrictive covenants that began to form in the late 1920s and 1930s. These were coalitions between property owners in sets of blocks, mostly in the south side, mid-south side of Chicago, and they were aligned with real estate agents in the courts to try to block African-American families from buying homes. And these could be legally enforced. This wasn't shot down until 1948. Woodlawn, east and west, So west is west of Cottage Grove, and Woodlawn East, both formed these kinds of agreements in 1930. And it's a dark part of the university's history, but the university provided legal support and advice and perhaps even financial funding for these homeowners organizations in Woodlawn. And the president at the time, President Hutchins, was called to account for it many times. And his response was always, well, the university has a deep economic investment in the south side of Chicago. And if the neighborhood tips, and this is another one of these sociological concepts, if it reaches a tipping point where there's a sufficient number of African-American families that move into an area, then you start to see white families moving out. And then they thought they would have a much larger number of issues to deal with. So with a bad conscience, Hutchins supported this. It's something he sorely regretted later in his life.
And we're still trying to work out of, aren't we?
Yeah. But that was kind of the first serious intervention of the university in the city, and it was a bad one. I could point out Hutchins' father was actually, so he was the president of Berea College in Kentucky, which had been founded to educate former slaves. Right?
Wow.
And the Hutchins family had been educators at Oberlin College, also as abolitionists. And you can find Hutchins writing to his father during the 1930s saying, well, this is really a strange thing that I'm doing, given that I'm part of the Hutchins family. So he knew that this was not.
He knew his own. He was complicit.
That's right.
And this still feeds into. It's really. I'm so glad you brought that up because it's beyond anecdotal. It informs so much of our present workings because we are rooted in aspects that have a tragic and unfortunate history. It'll be interesting to hear just later I'd love to get to your later when you talk a little bit about the now, but this is really setting the table for that. I appreciate it. Yeah. What's the next slide you got? I'm loving these.
All right, let's move on. Okay, so this brings us up to actually urban renewal, which is the next chapter in the kind of restrictive covenant story that I was telling. The story of urban renewal around Hyde Park and Kenwood is very complicated. It's not something I can unpack very much here, but it's a time when in the post-war era, there's a lot of population pressures that are coming into Chicago. A lot of it is migration of Black families from the South who are looking for work in the post-war urban centers. And there is also a serious lack of housing within the city, in part because there's been no investment during the years of the Great Depression or the war. So you have this kind of bad mix of forces. You have population pressure coming in, you have a lot of dilapidated housing, and then you have a market that's ripe for speculation. And you can bring in problems with redlining and restrictive covenants, and it adds up for a lot of problems. Now, I can talk a little bit about the university's perspective on how to address these things. So the university looked at its immediate neighborhood, both to the south here where Woodlawn is, and then in Hyde Park and Kenwood. And what it saw was really an existential threat by the early 1950s. One of the research projects I did for the college was just about the number of prize-winning faculty who were recruited by other universities in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. And it was just a saying that went around the university that, you could have one of the world's top flight research universities just looking at the people who have left in the last 15 years. It was because faculty, with rising rates of crime, with the deterioration of the neighborhood, didn't feel as though this was a safe place for their children to go to school. and they didn't feel as though they could conduct their research work and go in late to the laboratories and so on. So they began to leave en masse, and this was a problem for the administration. The second problem was that, as this happens with all urban universities and colleges now, students weren't coming, and parents didn't want to send their students in. And if you look along, this is 55th Street here, you can see Stagg Field. It doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
It's Rockefeller Library. There was a lot of very dense tenement housing that had been subdivided up illegally and then rented in predatory ways to families that were looking for housing, largely African-American families. So that's what you find both here on 55th Street, and then also over here, which is closer to where the hospital is. And you find a lot of it along this strip of Woodlawn also. So the university organizes, it goes directly to the federal government and to the city, and there's a use of eminent domain to start raising a lot of what was seen as dilapidated housing and deteriorated housing. And there are some efforts, though not sufficient, to replace it with affordable housing, so that the people who lose their housing and their social services, et cetera, aren't homeless, right? So that there's some provision being made for them. That is largely a story of Hyde Park and Kenwood, but this is very important for Woodlawn for a couple of reasons that I want to bring up. This was incredibly expensive. The university spent about $70 million of its money out of the endowment in the 1950s to do what they thought was saving the neighborhood. And when the Board of Trustees gathered, they looked at the funds they had received from the federal government, the monies they received from City Hall, and they decided they could not do any of this in Woodlawn. Right? So there's the negative side of urban renewal with clear-cutting housing and so on, but there's the positive side with sort of restoring streetscapes and putting in, having a police presence and funding schools and making sure that there are street lights and sort of enforcement of civil codes and so on. So the university decides in the 1950s that they can't afford to do this for Woodlawn. So I mean, this is a drastic simplification, but I mean, Woodlawn is, in a way, it's kind of abandoned. You don't have the massive investment of resources to deal with slumlords, for instance, or to deal with gang problems, or to deal with maintaining the neighborhood that you do elsewhere. So whereas Hyde Park and the university area sort of circles in on itself and adopts this kind of moat mentality that surrounds it. Woodlawn is set to the south, and again, it's left without a lot. Right. So that's one part of that story. The second part of the story that's really fateful for us today, and this is the memory of people who live in Woodlawn, is that after the university finishes with the main part of urban renewal, it does turn to Woodlawn. And some of the fascinating stuff I've seen in the university archive is disciplinary records from the Dean of Students office from the 1950s and 1960s. And what do students get in trouble in those days? Well, the same stuff they get in trouble with now. But there are a number of places that the Dean of Students identified as drug dens that were just within this zone here that you can see outlined. And students were getting arrested. There were kidnappings. There are high crime rates. And there was a lot of sort of dilapidated housing that was not well occupied, where you had absentee landlords. And so the university hatches a plan in 1960 with the city. And the city agrees that it will exercise eminent domain over this area between 60th and 61st Street, Cottage Grove to Stony Island, and raise a lot of the housing that was in disrepair, and then sell it back to the university.
Right.
again, without any plan to provide affordable housing or to deal with the populations that are displaced, which is really poor African American families. Woodlawn, by the late 1960s, is about 90% African American. So that becomes this signal that the university is intervening. There's a plan, an architectural plan to take this whole area and build a series of quadrangles that will extend from Stony Island to Cottage Grove. And it will include dorms and a research park and parking lots. And it would get rid of a lot of low-income housing. So the Woodlawn community finds out about this, and this is really the origins of the Woodlawn organization. I don't know if that's come up in other presentations, where you have a number of community leaders who organize a sit-in at City Hall. They work with the aldermen, and they actually block this plan, and they secure some concessions from the university. So it's at that point, and this is also really important for where we are today, the university signs a document saying that they will not develop anything or seek to purchase land south of 61st Street, which was a large concession. They would have purchased a lot of land that's further south, but this still holds. So the university is not purchasing land for its own express use. So there are other legal gray areas south of 61st Street. And in return, the Woodlawn organization and the dissenting aldermen gave the university a more or less a free hand between Cottage Grove and Stony Island. The other provision was that the university had to help Woodlawn build affordable housing projects that were along Stony Island and along Cottage Grove. So that's what took place in the 60s and 70s. But there are a lot of implications from this that created a lot of bad blood between the university and Woodlawn residents. One was that, and I can move along to some other slides, is that as the university and the city raised some of these properties, people were displaced. And each time that happens, there was a lot of community resentment, even though there was this allowing the university to do this. So one of these that was well documented was at Woodlawn and 60th, and it was the Constitution Apartments, and there was a long court battle over it. This is right where the Rubenstein Forum is being built now. And it was eventually torn down in 1975, I think. I can go back to some other ones. Some other implications of that, as the university did expand and filled in along 61st Street, this was always seen as being kind of part of a zero-sum game between Woodlawn and the university. Like it could be done by force, but it wasn't a mutually beneficial arrangement, which is not what any university wants to have with its surrounding environment, right?
Right.
And it feeds into this kind of moat mentality. And then the last part of it, I guess, big implication, students who came to study at the university between, I guess you could talk to alumni from like 1970 up through probably about 2000. They all remember being told, you just don't walk south of 61st Street. Right? So there's no police patrol there. This is where you remain. And they were given whistles to carry with them if they did have to do it. So this boundary that we talked about between the university and Woodlawn, it ends up really becoming solidified in new ways, and really negative ways, here in the 60s and 70s.
I'm just struck, I'm going to let you keep going, but I'm just struck again how we don't really know who we are or what we're dealing with until we understand our past. And this is, there's so many wonderful things about Chicago and the University of Chicago. There's also this tragic telling of that I think will be important for anyone who's watching this. I'm so grateful for even your visual images, but go ahead. It's just a stunning retelling of some of the heartache of our situation. And where else do you want to go?
Well,
I'm going to look forward toward the back end of kind of your view to the future, and as a man who's a committed Christian, what you might see coming down the road. But that's a difficult relationship, the story you've told.
Yeah. The other big contextual piece for all of this is that the university almost went bankrupt in these years. So these, as we were saying about earlier decades, these things are easier to sort out in times of abundance. But a number of different factors, the university's undergraduate enrollment collapsed in the 1950s, in part because of these issues, not entirely, but in part. And the university had drawn heavily out of its endowment to pay for urban renewal. And so the university almost ceased to exist as the University of Chicago, that we, as a top-rate university. And it didn't begin to recover really until the age of recovery is really in the 1990s, when you have reurbanization that is happening anyway. And it kind of lifts, it begins to lift Woodlawn, and it begins to lift the university as well. And then you have space, you have breathing room, where this isn't necessarily a zero-sum game. So I want to get back to say that this story from the 1990s. And remember, I said that the university, there's always this impulse to engage with the world and with the city doing what universities do. That is by producing research, by using the minds of students, by using sort of voluntary work, and not to try to do things that are outside the purview of the university, like building large housing developments, or doing irresponsible things with investments or something else, which is a possibility for engaging cities too. And in the 1990s, what I want to emphasize here at the end, the university started to think of all kinds of ways that this zone of demarcation that Woodlawn became, and this strip between 60th and 61st, they build a lot of bridges and start finding ways to have mutually productive relationships with Woodlawn again, by letting the university do what it does. So a couple of those things, and all of these addressed grievances that residents had from the 60s and 70s. So one of those grievances was that there was no protection or support for schools in Woodlawn. Whereas, look at the history of the Ray School, for instance, received all kinds of assistance, right? So the university founded a charter school network. The first of those was in North Kenwood, Oakland. My sons went there for several years. But the main high school plant is there along 63rd Street now. And there is a junior high, and there is another elementary school as well. And the reasoning behind this, and the charter school network isn't owned by the university, it's supported by the university, it's a separate entity. But the university has all of this intellectual capital in the meaning of education, and even in sort of secondary education and early childhood education. Why not use that to try to produce something that's going to be useful to the community, right, to provide high quality education? And the university put up most of the money that supported the charter school network. So that's one example. There's something I mentioned before we started recording. There was a new program started in, I think, 2001, where the university wanted to encourage faculty and staff to come and live in Woodlawn. Not only Woodlawn, there was support for Kenwood as well, but staff were given significant subsidies to in the form of down payment assistance to buy homes in Woodlawn, so that you don't have. It's going to be the opposite of white flight. It's the encouragement to stay and be part of the neighborhood. Then, as the university began to build in this swath between 60th and 61st Street, there have been commitments to provide hundreds of permanent jobs for local residents, primarily from Woodlawn, South Shore, Grand Crossing, who work in the dining halls for the dorms, who work for the facilities staff, who receive construction contracts, and so on, so that the university is fused together with the economic life of the South Side. So the university has become the South Side's largest employer. And a lot of that has been intentionally directed back to the near South Side. I believe it was the late 1990s, the university committed to extend the patrol area for the UCPD from 61st Street to 64th Street, which was something that the Woodlawn organization had been asking for decades. And then there are other examples. The Logan Center.
The Logan Center is one, and I'm sure there are a number of others. But it's also good to hear this part of it, not just the capital reinvestment, but the community investment side as a contributor is in a healthier place today than it would have been in some of those decades you were marching us through.
That's right. So it's a commitment not just to provide funding for resources, but to bring students and faculty and staff back into the life of Woodlawn. So there's skin in the game, right? So that people care what happens. The last thing that I would mention as part of this new approach as the Office of Civic Engagement has been operating under a number of different names, but there's a small business incubator. There are programs that send students off to be tutors and mentors in schools on the South Side. There are all kinds of training programs for employment assistance. So these are ways that the university is using its intellectual capital to try to do something positive with the community. So I know that the focus of concerns in Woodlawn now, it's largely about gentrification. Are things heating up too fast? But I think it's really important to step back and think about the sort of historically yesterday and then the day before yesterday that we're growing out of and trying to become a cohesive South Side that works together again. That's all I got.
Great. No, that's great. You had one more slide though, didn't you, or no?
I did. Oh, yeah, that's true. That's this is a rendering of what Hyde Park and Woodlawn and the Midway are going to look like after the new construction phase is over with. And I just wanted everyone to think about this relative to the first slides we looked at of the kind of the monastery or the cloister that's here at the top part of the screen. Now this here is the stretch between 60th and 61st Street. And rather than having a kind of aesthetically hostile, symbolic approach to Woodlawn, it's an extension of the university into Woodlawn, and it's more fluid. Right?
Yeah.
So you can actually see the way that these relationships have changed, looking at how the university imagines itself now.
This has been incredibly informative and very helpful. What's your sense of just your optimism for life between what is the Midway and 67th? As you are a historian and have looked back, Any two or three things that you think about that are especially important for the next 10 years going forward?
So I think it is. So as I noted, the questions that we're grappling with now are new questions. They are not the questions of the 20th century. So we're thinking about not how to bring populations together, but about how you manage development and you manage growth. And again, so I haven't given any of this with the intention of speaking for the university. It's just my historical.
No. Yeah, no.
But
the historical end has been fascinating.
I think it's really important that the university, as far as I can see, really is committed to the idea of a managed growth that takes seriously the perspective and the experience of the vulnerable, at the same time as thinking about its own interests, right? And that there's space now, there's both space and commitment for trying to manage those things. And then so Woodlawn is not as politically cohesive now, to my mind, as it seems to have been in the 60s or 70s. You have a lot of different representatives and different interests. But those representatives are willing to work with the university on a lot of different issues. So what's really encouraging to me is that a lot of the zero-sum rhetoric seems to be gone, and that there seems to be a lot of commitment to problem solving.
Great. Outside of the history of it all, just as a husband, a father, someone who lives in Woodlawn now, and I know you plan to keep living in Woodlawn, and you're in a church that's now situated at 60, it will be restoring 62nd and Woodlawn. It feels to me as though, I've said it in the past, I feel as though we have the University of Chicago off our back shoulder, and we have this opening to the whole south side out our front door. The building is strategically located. Any aspirations in your own heart, or any thoughts about the strategic nature of Christ Church and what the Lord might be having us do in this neighborhood over the next 50 years?
Oh, those are huge questions. I'm very glad for them. Well, I love the emphasis on student ministry. So Amy and I and my sons have been living in student housing here in the Woodlawn neighborhood, one of the South Campus dorms, for the last 5 years, and we're moving out. And we understand that students now have there's a great need for spiritual accommodation like this. So in the 1930s, you had a really vibrant kind of YMCA culture and Christian Endeavor Society and these evangelical associations that operated in Hyde Park and served students who were really committed evangelical Christians who would have said that was how they identified themselves. And they worked with fraternities and other parts of student life. And they operated on 53rd Street and 63rd Street now too, where you have the new YMCA. But those things have been totally absent for the last 80, 90 years because of the way that the university changed. It became so much more of a graduate institution, and the amenities for undergraduate life and for thinking about student needs beyond intellectual needs, really were shortchanged. So I think one of the great opportunities with reference to students is giving them a place to come and hang out and to be welcomed and to sort out the questions that they have, and to eat and be able to study and be able to talk with people about the deepest questions of salvation and the gospel at the same time as they're thinking about the college core. So I know that's incredibly important. But then this strategic section, students also have, keeping with this theme of engagement outward with the city, that's what students want to be involved in now. I spent a lot of my professional time at work thinking about ways that the curriculum can be engaged with the city and how we can get faculty and students connected with community partners. And to think that the church can be part of this outward-facing movement of a Christian culture in the university area that is not just self-confident, but is committed to having these conversations, that speaks across racial and ethnic lines, and does it from a position where a location where that makes sense. I'm excited to see how that develops.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to leave it there. But Dan Koehler, you have helped us immeasurably through this historical run between the University of Chicago and Woodlawn. I thank you for your time. Many of us owe you a great debt, and we're grateful that you're in the neighborhood and making a contribution.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me.